1, 2, testing 1, 2. Check 1, 2, testing 1, 2, check 1, 2, 3, 4. Check 1, 2, testing 1, 2, check 1. Check 1, 2, testing 1, 2, check 1, 2, 3, 4, check 1, 2, testing 1, 2. Check 1, 2, testing 1, 2.
Well, thank you all for coming out this afternoon. We were here in this room a little while ago watching the first round of the NCAA basketball tournament on the screen, big screen. Anyway, to move on. Great to be here. This is part of a couple days of celebration of the 30th anniversary of AU Abroad in Brussels. It's been a remarkable program over the years, and for 2/3 of its life, it's been directed by Jerry Sheridan, who's here today, and has just done an amazing job with that program over the years. So just want to say thanks to Jerry for all that you've done for the program in Brussels, and to thank Sarah Dumont for all she does from this end for it. So. And I know we have folks on the live stream as well. We're using the hashtag SAS NATO, which you can use for the discussion, for asking questions during the discussion. One of the great features of the program is that it has one of the finest professors one could have in the program, and that's Jamie Shea, who, when he's not a professor in the Brussels program, is an extremely distinguished official at NATO. I'm going to tell you some of the things that he's done at NATO over the years. He's currently Deputy Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges. Previously was Deputy Assistant Secretary General for External Relations, and before that, Director of Information and Press, spokesman of NATO, and Deputy Director of Information and Press, which he was doing during the 1999 Kosovo War, when, for those of us who were paying close attention, Jamie became something of a rock star during that war, explaining to us all that was going on. Before that was a speechwriter and held other positions within the organization. He's also taught at a variety of institutions, none of which are as important as American University, so I'm not going to mention them. I just, on a personal note, I've just learned a tremendous amount about NATO from Jamie over the years. Greatly appreciate the help he's given me on a couple of the books that I've written on the subject. And this is a great time to refocus on NATO. So there's a lot going on. I'm looking forward. Jamie's going to make a few introductory remarks. He and I are then going to move over, and I'm going to begin the conversation from there, and then we'll open it up to everybody here. So Jamie, thanks for being here.
Jim, thanks a lot for those very kind introductory remarks. I must say it's great to have friends and partners in crime in important deanships at good universities. I'm delighted about that. It's great to see so many alums, former students, who have been on the Brussels program, and see that your appetite for NATO updates is as undiminished as ever, and you don't look at all older. Don't say the same about me than when I saw you for the last time. Sarah, again, also thank you, and Mark, for all of the assistance over the last couple of days for a really fabulous sort of return home, and also to celebrate the 30 years of the program, which means that soon Jerry and I will have the grandchildren of the people who were there at the very beginning. That was a marvelous experience last night, so thank you again. I am fortunate to have certainly the longest title in NATO. I usually have to give people 2 business cards to fit the whole thing on, you know, Deputy Secretary Assistant, yes, Deputy Assistant Secretary General. I'm not really any of them. I hate being a deputy. I'm not a secretary or an assistant, and I'll never, unfortunately, be a general. It's too late for that. Somehow, individually, they seem to be more meaningful than when they're put together. But anyway, there you go. And I'm very pleased to see such a big turnout. I can't believe this. You've obviously been all sort of promised A grades or whatever, if you just sort of keep your bum on the seat for the duration of my lecture. There's a lot to talk about. And I know that what we're intending to do this afternoon is Jim is going to ask me the $64,000 questions, and I'm going to pretend to answer. So let's get to that as quickly as possible, because I think that that's probably going to be more instructive than what I have to say. So let me try to keep my introductory remarks short. We are, of course, in a very difficult time in European security. In fact, when I sort of close my eyes and think about where we are, it seems almost surreal. After the end of the Cold War, so many years of reaching out to former adversaries and seducing them either into NATO membership, although many of them were quite happily seduced and wanted to apply in the first place, or at least in the case of Russia, establishing cooperative councils and increasingly trying to define areas of of common interest. In fact, before the most recent events, we thought we were making progress with Russia because we had a much better dialogue in Afghanistan, where the Russians were helping us with counter-narcotics. They had set up trust funds to help to train, including in Russia, Afghan counter-narcotics personnel. They were helping to train Afghan helicopter pilots. We were even, believe it or not, buying Russian helicopters to give to the Afghan army because, of course, it's easier for them to operate these old Soviet-style models. We had the Russians involved in cooperative airspace in Europe. We had several exercises with them where we were doing sort of hijacking exercises. We were doing search and rescue at sea with the Russians. In fact, you won't believe this, but the first mission that NATO ever conducted under Article 5, the collective defence of the North Atlantic Treaty, which was called Active Endeavour in the Mediterranean, included a Russian ship. Almost surreal, but of course it came in response to the terrorist attacks against the United States on 9/11, and we had a good cooperation with the Russian ships participating in a counter-piracy operation in the Gulf of Aden. It's true that our cooperation with Russia on events outside Europe was going more smoothly than events inside Europe, but we at least could look forward to a time where the talk of a NATO strategic partnership with Russia would actually bear some resemblance to reality, even if a partnership doesn't happen simply because you keep on talking about it. What has gone wrong? Well, I think obviously we have not picked up on the warning signs, which have been there for some time. I was in Munich, some others like Stu may have been there as well, a few years ago when we heard President Putin formally declare his unhappiness with the post-European security settlement based on what he sees as double standards and an interference in the natural sphere of influence of Russia. We probably didn't pick up when he declared to President Bush at the Bucharest summit in 2008 that, as far as he was concerned, Ukraine was not a real state, but a purely artificial state. We didn't perhaps pick up when talks on tactical nuclear weapons in Europe or on conventional force balances came to a halt, when Russia abrogated the CFE treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty, in the sense that Russia started to refuse observation missions or refuse to exchange data with us. We also probably didn't react when suddenly we saw an increasing momentum of Russian military exercises around the periphery of the Ukraine and others, and going into Belarus, where the figures that were given to us, 10,000 peacekeeping, didn't actually bear out what we were seeing in reality, which was 40,000, 50,000, and the types of scenarios, particularly offensive air operations, which clearly went beyond the scope of peacekeeping. So probably, like with all diplomats, we tended, which is a sort of what the French call a déformation professionnelle, to focus perhaps on the more positive side of the agenda and maybe not pick up on some of the warning signs, although of course the Russian military incursion into Georgia in 2008, after which time two major provinces of Georgia effectively came under Russia's control, and certainly not under the control of Tbilisi, again was a sign. But what we're seeing in Ukraine obviously represents if not a paradigm shift, but at least a major shift in the European security scene. The Secretary General of NATO has described it as the worst crisis since the end of the Cold War. And it's not simply because of Crimea. It's because use of force has been used without any prior negotiation, without any prior attempt to seek a kind of diplomatic outcome to this particular crisis. It's been used at the beginning of the crisis rather than at the end. Secondly, we have now got a situation which is very perilous in a place like Europe, where countries are sort of arrogating to themselves the right to decide on the fate of minorities who are in a different country simply because they happen to speak the same language. I mean, if you sort of push this to an extreme in Europe, then what about does France take a natural interest in the French-speaking Walloons, or does the Netherlands decide to protect the Dutch-speaking Flemings in Belgium, or the Slovakia or Hungary immediately take a proprietorial interest in their brethren in Romania or in other parts? I mean, this would be a legacy for endless stability, given that virtually every European country has a multi-ethnic character and often a federal or a confederal character. And if the use of force, the military instrument, is now once again seen as the key tool of diplomacy, the way to assert power, the way to become influential, then what we are seeing at the moment, which is a rather alarming increase in global armament spending, is likely to continue, not just in Europe. For example, next year, on present trends, for the first time, the rest of the world will outspend the NATO countries on the military. Germany has now fallen behind Saudi Arabia. Russia has now pulled ahead of France, the UK, and Germany combined. If you looked at the map of military spending a few years ago, there were about 5 NATO allies who were in the global top 10. Today there are only 3, and it will be probably down to 1, the United States, very, very, very soon. Even if the United States, of course, yes, on an individual basis, it is still the world's largest military spender. But we are seeing an alarming shift of military power away from the NATO countries. Now, this may not in itself be alarming. Some countries spend more on the military simply because they become richer without necessarily increasing the proportion of their GDP. But if on top of that we allow the idea to quickly take root that you can impose fait accompli through military force and get away with it, then there's no doubt many other people will quickly try to do the same thing, and we'll go to a more chaotic world. Now, the danger, of course, or the two big issues, whenever this happens very briefly, is to try to answer the following questions. Number one, what if I overreact? Would I make the situation worse? Would my attempted de-escalatory steps produce the opposite escalatory? So what is a truly de-escalatory step? But on the other hand, if I don't react, if I'm too weak, if I'm too soft, if I just sort of let this go and bury my head in the sand, hope it's all going to go away, then what will be the consequences tomorrow? So how can I sort of give Russia what John Kerry calls the off-ramp, the ability to sort of get out of this, a contact group, a discussion with Kiev, while there is still a chance, while at the same time making it clear through sanctions and through real measures that there will be a price to be paid, and that these measures can get progressively worse if there isn't a peaceful resolution to this crisis. That's going to be the first critical test, not to underreact, but neither to overreact. The second issue that's going to affect NATO is what part of our existing agenda, where we were merrily going along yesterday, quite happily, towards the NATO summit in Wales next September, an agenda which was based on cooperative security, partnerships, capability building in Africa, preserving interoperability with Australia and New Zealand in case we had to do an operation as far away as Afghanistan again, looking at normative aspects of security like the protection of women in armed conflicts, Resolution 1325. In other words, a NATO in waiting, a NATO supporting others, a NATO as the educator. To what degree does this agenda now suddenly be redundant? Is it in our interest to dump it, as I said in class, to wipe the blackboard or the whiteboard clean and to start over again? Or would that be a mistake? Would it be a mistake to drop this agenda simply to focus exclusively on Russia and Ukraine? Because, as I pointed out, this crisis doesn't mean to say that Assad is going to be less brutal in Syria. The rift between Sunni and Shia is not going to continue in the Middle East. Borders will be ripped apart. Iraq will have considerable problems in terms of maintaining its coherence. Al-Qaeda will continue to spread through the Sahel, etc., etc., etc. These problems, unfortunately, will be with us. Al-Qaeda will not take a break, a sort of time out, while the Ukraine crisis is playing out. And when this crisis is over, those other issues will still be there. So to what degree should we ditch that agenda? But to what degree does this new situation have such important demands that we should reinvent now the NATO summit and focus on it. Let me, at least this very provisional stage, because we still don't know where we're going to be in 2 weeks' time, at least try to draw four big conclusions. Number one, it's very important that NATO practice reassurance for those new member states who quite justifiably are very nervous, particularly the Baltic states with significant Russian-speaking minorities, and the situation in Estonia has already been pinpointed by some members of the Russian government. The good news is the United States is back. Worries in Europe a couple of weeks ago that President Obama was pivoting to the Asia Pacific, that Europe would now have to take care of its own security, that the United States would not be prepared to maintain a significant presence in Europe. As I said to Jerry, I waved the last American tank goodbye from Bremerhaven last summer, that the US would be sort of disengaged. That seems to have been contradicted by the crisis. The United States has reacted very well, redeploying planes, if you've seen, to the Baltic states, to Poland, increasing the momentum of exercises, bringing exercises forward. The US has very nicely sent back 60 tanks to Grafenwehr, a testing ground in Germany, where we can once again do serious exercises, given US European Command a role to preserve interoperability post-Afghanistan between Americans and Europeans. Vice President, excuse me, I'm promoting him prematurely. Vice President Biden has been, as you see in Poland and the Baltic states, to reassure. The United States has been crystal clear that when it comes to NATO commitments, they will be respected and fulfilled. That is a tremendous psychological signal. I also add that the fact that that was taken by the United States rather than by NATO is also, to my mind, a de-escalatory situation. So the first thing, of course, is to provide that kind of reassurance. If there is a red line which has to be red and not go pink, that red line has to be that no NATO country can be attacked. But second conclusion is collective defence is back. Now, collective defence in NATO, of course, over the last 20 years is something that wasn't really top of the agenda. We didn't face a threat. I no longer had to go home and tell my wife at night that I'd spent the day waiting to be attacked, as during the Cold War. A lovely way to earn your salary, by the way, to wait to be attacked. I could go home and tell my wife that, in fact, we were reinterpreting Article 5 to cover cyber attacks against critical infrastructure from anonymous or other hacktivist groups, or that, like on 9/11, we would use Article 5 much more as a gesture of political solidarity with a country facing a terrorist attack than to mount a major conventional defence of a NATO frontier. I could say that if Article 5 is invoked, it's more likely to send us to Afghanistan than to the border between Poland and Belarus. But conventional defence is back. Not because anybody is anticipating any conflict anytime soon, no. But whereas yesterday I could have said it's unthinkable. War in Europe, unthinkable. Forget it. As like before 1914 in many respects, where also people wrote books about why war was unthinkable. The military instrument can no longer be ruled out. And certainly NATO cannot allow anybody to believe that it could not implement Article 5. But can we? Can we? I think this is a legitimate question we have to face. The number of American forces in Europe, their disposition, the fact we have very little infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe, because when Germany was united back in 1990, we said to the Russians that we would not put troops or infrastructure in Central and Eastern Europe. If there was a crisis, could we foresee it? Is our situational awareness good enough to anticipate what might happen? We've been taken by surprise far too often. Particularly as now most of our AWACS aircraft are, guess where? In Afghanistan. It's very difficult to have enough forces to cover more than one contingency at a time. When was the last time we exercised our contingency plans? Let me tell you something. In our NATO latest planning, we are planning to do an exercise involving about 20 to 22,000 troops once every 3 years for connected forces, which is, for us, an ambitious level. the Russians have been exercising 150,000 troops practically every day of the week for several months in snap alert exercises which continue to go on. So we're going to have to think, really is our exercise schedule, is the type of scenarios that we're planning for really up to what we need, particularly at a time, as I said, when we don't have the transparency of Russian activities that we would have had a few years ago when the CFE Treaty and the Vienna document of the OSCE. Class, remember the OSCE and the Vienna document? You haven't forgotten, right? It gave us that kind of data exchange. And so an urgent task, to my mind, for the NATO summit is to do a true baseline assessment of our conventional defence posture and to make sure that we can get it into the shape it has to be quickly. The third aspect is that, of course, we've got to help the fragile states on the periphery of Russia who are feeling the pressure. This may be more a job for the EU in the first instance, obviously, because it's mainly economic support. In the case of Ukraine, it's very much making sure the elections go smoothly, making sure the Ukrainians don't shoot themselves in the foot, for example, by introducing laws banning the use of Russian as an official language in administration. We perhaps should have focused before on the coherence of Ukraine instead of making very high demands of reform that couldn't be met before we produced aid. That said, we don't want to go to the other extreme and now throw a lot of aid down a bottomless pit, which will be wasted. But we've got to look very hard at what we can do to improve the resilience of Moldova, of Azerbaijan, a vital energy transit corridor, and to help these countries. The more we can remove any kind of reason for Russia to believe that its situation is somehow strategically imperiled by instability in these countries, the better for us. And political reassurance, going there, visiting them, engaging with them, show them that we care, is going to be important. This is a great moment for the European Union also to step up to the plate and demonstrate that it can be a strategic actor. The EU perhaps has concentrated on too many things in the past, wanting to have a mission in Latin America, wanting to have a policy for the Asia Pacific. All of this is very good, but in a moment of crisis, the key thing is to set priorities and to follow those priorities, which have to be in the European neighbourhood. The fourth and final thing, of course, is what can we do vis-à-vis Russia? Well, the answer, of course, is not much in the immediate term. Russia is obviously prepared for this crisis. These people going into Ukraine with their uniforms, they didn't simply take off their lapel badges the night before they went in. I mean, this clearly has been carefully sort of thought through and orchestrated. And we hear reports that Russia has prepared itself for sanctions by pulling dollars out of the United States and other places and putting them into Singapore or elsewhere, as if it's prepared perhaps for a sort of siege of sanctions. Again, we don't want to do anything that wouldn't give Putin the ramp down should he choose to take that route. But in the long run, Russia is vulnerable. A statistic I often like to quote is that in the days of Mr. Gorbachev in 1985, Russia earned about 65% of its foreign earnings from oil and gas. Today it's 74%. In other words, the dependency is greater under a Russia which has been involved in the market economy than it was in communist times. There is more state control, believe it or not, of vital Russia of industry than there was even in the final days of communism when they were at least having a modest privatization. Gorbachev's Russia was only 4% involved in world trade. Russia today is massively involved in world trade. Its dealings with the European Union alone amount to over 100 billion euros, not dollars, every year. So obviously, in the long run, Russia has a lot to lose from any kind of cut-off from these type of markets and any kind of trade, as do Russian oligarchs, of course, if they can no longer go to their yachts in the Adriatic Sea or go and sort of look at how their bank accounts are doing in New York and London. We should not think that because we don't have any kind of immediate silver bullet option that we have no option options at all. We have to use them wisely, but we have to make sure that we're serious about it, and that this isn't going to be the case where people wait for the thing to blow over after a week and to be forgotten and back to business as usual. So in a nutshell, before we get into debate with Jim, this is going to be a testing time. I know a lot of you are going around saying, Jamie, isn't it great? NATO's back. Hey, all your problems are over. You've now got, a major strategic challenge to deal with. You can now, don't worry about job cuts in Brussels or downsizing. But, okay, maybe it's true that NATO is now back in the spotlight. But I would also argue this is going to be one of the most challenging periods of NATO's history. We've got to show unity, working transatlantically. We've got to adopt the right policies of openness to dialogue as well as firmness. We've got to manage this new paradigm at a time when our own defence budgets have been declining and our capabilities have been declining. And believe me, if we can't use this crisis to start doing some reform of European defence. You remember in class, those of you, my former students here, we used to speak about pooling and sharing, smart defence. You remember all of that? Division of labour. I see you all smiling and nodding. If we can't do it in this crisis, to get the capabilities we need, because defence budgets aren't going to shoot up, we'll never be able to do it, frankly. And we mustn't lose sight of all of these other things. It would be a tragedy to lose Australia as a partner because we are focusing purely on Europe, or to lose sight of what's going on in Africa. So yes, it's good that NATO is back, but my God, this is going to be a tough time, such I think as we've never really faced before, conceptually and intellectually. Final conclusion, bad news for me, bureaucrat. Lots of my bum on a seat, long meetings of the North Atlantic Council, had that already. A lot of drafting of statements, a lot of agonising over the right option to take. Great news for you in the academic community and the students. It's not going to be boring, right? Fascinating issues, debates going ahead. All the more reason to send your children when they're born to Brussels to catch up on the latest news. But certainly the fact you're here today shows that you are still engaged in all of this, and that's the most encouraging sign, because this is not a crisis that's going to end overnight. Unfortunately, this is going to go on, and keeping engaged and keeping focused is going to be the key for the weeks ahead. So thank you very much. Sorry, Joe. I'm a TV star, but I never learned to... No. This guy's obviously a pro. He put his on in 1 nanosecond. Thank you. Sorry.
No, that was great. Thank you for getting us off to such a great start. I want to pick up where you just left off. And there's been a tension within NATO for some years now between those who really wanted the alliance to focus more on the threat from Russia that they perceived, and that was especially the new members, and others who said, if NATO is going to remain relevant, it has got to go out and deal with these emerging security challenges. The threats are global. NATO can't just focus on Europe. It's got to deal with the threats that are arising from other parts of the world. And also, it is the only institution that's capable of dealing with a lot of the things that do emerge from around the world. This crisis would seem to enable those who've said, see, we told you, we've got to focus more on Russia and we've got to focus more on Europe and not do all of these global endeavors and build these global partnerships. This crisis would seem to give them the upper hand right now. But how do we, especially going into the summit in the fall, maintain the importance of the global partnerships and dealing with the threats that haven't gone away because of Ukraine and what Russia's doing in Ukraine? Those global threats still exist.
Absolutely. No, Jim, you're quite right. Honesty compels me to say that obviously for the next few weeks and months,
Right.
we'll be focusing on the Ukrainian-Russian issue because it's the most urgent, and obviously you have to focus on the urgent, even if it's not always the most important. But this is also the most urgent and the most important. That's crystal clear. We have to provide the reassurance that I mentioned, and we have to find a coherent way of addressing these partners who feel very fragile. They don't have security guarantees, but also it would send a very bad signal to anybody who wants to be a partner to NATO that we don't help them in a sticky situation. Particularly, of course, when for the last 10 years, Jim, as you know very well, we've been only too happy to have their troops coming with us in Afghanistan. And if the sense is that, remember John Kennedy, don't ask what you can do for, what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. If the sense gets out that this is a one-way thing and the partners are not as helped, this is not going to stand us in good stead at all. So yes, it's absolutely true. Now, one aspect, however, is that many of the things that we were going to be doing for a kind of global role, and if not global, at least sort of outside Europe, I mentioned the capacity building, the cyber aspects, for instance, the focus on upgrading partnerships, the interoperability militarily with partners. Those things can be focused on Europe. In other words, we can go ahead with them, but just say that, the defence capability building may not be in Mali or Libya right away. It may take place more in Moldova or Ukraine or somewhere else more in the vicinity. But the structures that we're going to set up, training hubs, using the centres of excellence, upgrading NATO's cyber defence potential, all of that remains valid. You just sort of switch the geographical focus in the hope that obviously when such time you're through this crisis and things are more relaxed, we saw with the pivot to Asia that anything which is a pivot can be repivoted and often quite quickly, and then we can focus somewhere else. So to my mind, that would be part of the answer. It's not that the existing agenda suddenly becomes non-valid. We won't have Afghanistan in terms of an ISAF operation, so we would have done the exercises in Europe anyway. The difference between yesterday and today is that those exercises yesterday would have been more theoretical. They wouldn't have been practicing a contingency plan. They wouldn't have been linked to deterrence, for example. They would have been essentially about having an exercise to preserve interoperability. Well, you still do the exercise, clearly. You still want to demonstrate the United States is capable of coming back to Europe with brigade combat teams in a crisis, but now maybe you'll put a bit more heavy armour in to show that there is a defence aspect to this. You may look at the geographical location of where you're doing this exercise, and you may, as I say, link it more to the scenario. So to some degree, I can see a middle ground between, the old agenda, which I was describing in my talk, and immediately responding to the crisis. The other thing, which is part of your very good question, is not losing the situational awareness of what's going on. I mean, what tends to happen is that you pull all of your intel resources out of, say, Afghanistan, and you start focusing on what's happening in the Russian Western and Southern military districts. The price you then pay is that you totally lose your sense of where the next crisis is coming from, the threats of what's going on. So even if we are not able immediately, as I say, to do things in Africa, the key thing is at least to keep that kind of situational awareness, which gives us a sense of what's happening in these regions. The other thing is that, essentially, if you look at what Europe has in terms of military forces collectively, if we get the defence part of the picture right in terms of using those forces more optimally, should allow us to do more than one mission. I mean, after all, the NATO level of ambition, which we promulgated, as you remember, some time ago, was to do half a dozen sort of minor missions and 2 big missions. Well, that may not be totally realistic today in the light of European defence cuts, but the level of ambition was always to be able to handle more than just one scenario at a time. So to some degree we have to. Also, the capability building, final point, doesn't involve a lot of troops. It's more using your existing establishments to train people from Central Africa or Libya or whatever. It's more getting the strategy right rather than being manpower heavy. I mean, for example, we've done a study, I'll finish on this, at NATO, which shows, that the capacity building costs only 1/60th of ISAF in Afghanistan, prevention. So to some degree, these are quite modest missions which are not, expense heavy. So good question, but but we have to find a way of being able to keep our eye on more than one scenario at a time.
One of the things that Georgia showed us in 2008, and we've relearned again with what's been going on in Ukraine, is that, as you also pointed out in your remarks, these states in between NATO and Russia are quite vulnerable. We really didn't find a mechanism that would provide for their security. We have assumed that those countries that did come into NATO are secure, and we have gone along believing that because of Article 5, the Baltics, Poland, others really don't have to worry about their security. They are much more nervous today than they were previously. President Putin has even made remarks in recent days about Russians in the Baltic countries. And certainly the United States and NATO have responded. From the U.S. standpoint, the sending F-16s to Poland, increased patrols over the Baltic airspace, sending Vice President Biden to the region, have all been designed for that reassurance. How much reassurance do you think these countries need? Or in other words, how vulnerable do you think they feel right now? They are in NATO, which means they should feel secure. And you would think the Russians would recognize, well, there is a difference between countries that aren't in and countries that are in. But the insecurity is heightened. The vulnerability seems greater. How much does that matter right now?
Well, I think reassurance is a matter of, first of all, political psychology, and secondly, of concrete steps. I think that, I mentioned this, what the United States has done in recent days applies to both of those scenarios. A very important high-level visit. You mentioned Vice President Biden in the region, and the sending of the aircraft and the stepping up of the training, the stepping up of maritime exercises, aircraft which were at Lakenheath in the United Kingdom being sort of transferred to the Baltic states, at least on a temporary basis. The US has also done a lot in recent days by, as I mentioned, giving EUCOM now this role in European training for NATO, which it didn't really have before, sending a US general to be in charge of the new NATO land command in Turkey, for example, stationing of Osprey aircraft in the United Kingdom. All signs that show that the last American tank leaving was not necessarily that the US was abandoning Europe. I mean, don't forget, the United States still has 60,000 troops in Europe, all told. Okay, Cold War standards, it's much smaller, but still, it's one of the more significant US foreign presences. And there is this commitment which the United States has given to rotate from Fort Hood, Texas, a brigade combat team, to be part of the NATO response force. You're familiar with this, of course, which would be one of NATO's first instruments. So to my mind, the US is probably getting it about right now in terms of this kind of picture. But having started, you have to continue. That nervousness is going to be there, I think, for some time to come. Now, the real question, which I mentioned, is whether you go beyond these kind of demonstrations to look more at things like infrastructure. Remember the 3 no's that we gave to the Russians back in 1990? No nuclear weapons, no combat forces, and no infrastructure. Well, I can't speculate on that for the future, but the idea of infrastructure, at least in terms of a NATO presence, in terms of bases or whatever, is something that maybe we would need to look at in view of the situation. The other thing, of course, is that the Baltic states in particular never invested in an air force, because the message that we gave to them at the time of Afghanistan was don't waste your money on this. You don't need that, because what we need are ground forces, brigades, battalions for Afghanistan. And so the deal is that they will do that provided that NATO provides the more conventional force elements. Otherwise, you're going to see a free-for-all where everybody will go back to large armies, reserve forces, territorial defence. which I don't think is in NATO's interest, because there will be other contingencies. So the willingness of the allies to show that this division of labour is something that they're still willing to work towards, I think over the next couple of weeks is going to be very important as well. But don't ever underestimate the psychological aspects of this, which visits by senior politicians makes a big impact. Showing the flag is just as important for deterrence as having a tank in your backyard.
Yeah, I back when I was doing work on the whole question of NATO enlargement and looking at the Senate discussion and, even prior to that first ratification vote for those countries that came in 1999, and then I think even more for those that came in later, my feeling was that if the Senate thought that they were really extending Article 5 guarantees to all these countries and those were going to be, have to be delivered on, you may not have gotten those folks to vote for that enlargement. They were essentially, at the time, voting to bring in countries in an atmosphere in which it really didn't seem like you would actually have to go to defend these countries.
In the early days, yeah.
And I think that is something that really now is in the forefront. I don't think we're going to have a war between NATO and Russia and the United States and Russia, but what we don't know is what else Putin has in mind. And I think it seems to me that's the most challenging aspect of this. Does he have something in mind with respect to the Transnistria region of Moldova? Does he have designs on more of Ukraine? Even if he doesn't make a move against a Baltic country, he can still, just through his language and through troop movements and so on, just create enough uncertainty that he really does affect NATO as an institution and the dynamics within NATO. And it seems to me that's a real challenge for the alliance going forward.
Well, I think the first thing is we have to have good situational awareness. It's very important not to be caught by surprise. We have to look at the balance between sort of overt military moves like major exercises, backfire bombers and so on, constantly flying around the borders, these snap alert sort of measures, and other kind of things like reports of all of these Russian tourists, in inverted commas, crossing the border into Ukraine and what's happening there. My own sense is that what we badly need to do, at least as far as eastern Ukraine is concerned, is to put in some kind of OSCE-style monitoring force, which can, as we saw in Yugoslavia, can keep its ear to the ground and give us a very accurate assessment of what's going on in the situation there. I mean, obviously, the most key thing is not to have sort of violent clashes taking place that then do two things. Number one is obviously provide some kind of casus belli for a Russian intervention. But number two, start repeating what we saw tragically in the Balkans, which is that people who consider themselves as Russian Ukrainians suddenly start considering themselves as a sort of threatened minority and start seeing themselves as Russians. You remember, the Yugoslav identity was completely fractured in the 1990s as everybody redefined themselves as a defensive gesture, as Bosniak or Serb or Croat or whatever, and then we got into a situation of polarization, which was very difficult to get out of. So that kind of monitoring force, I think, would be the first thing that we need to achieve. And of course, that's a Ukrainian thing. It's not like the situation we have in Crimea at the moment. The second thing, though, is to try to do what we can to deconstruct this sort of narrative, which is that the Russians are a threatened minority. There is absolutely no evidence whatever for this whatsoever. Or the other thing you hear all the time is that Crimea is like Scotland. A referendum, where people should be able to decide, and we've heard this, or even like Kosovo, so if you guys can do it, why can't we? And I think we've got to constantly sort of deconstruct this, that no, Scotland has been prepared for years, the British Parliament voted for it, the Scottish Assembly voted for it, there's an organised campaign. You as a journalist, if you were, could actually go to Scotland to report on a campaign, there's a debate, it's a constitutionally organised process. And stop, please, bringing in all of these false analogies, which sort of imply that, we're doing nothing that you guys haven't done before. To try to to deconstruct that kind of narrative, which is all powerful, because one of the things that's very interesting in all of this is not only the military action, it's this kind of information propaganda blast that's going on to suggest that, you know, Russia is acting defensively. You know, we didn't want to do this, but we had to, that this is the responsibility to protect, you know, for some kind of threatened minority as well, that we've got international law on our side. And I think we've got to be very, very clear. You know, even if we can't do a lot physically at the moment, we can do things in this kind of information warfare. For example, in the case of Ukraine, you have considerable hacking into their systems, for example, their communications and the rest. Cyber is an element of all modern conflict. So anything that the international community could do to help the Ukrainians with intelligence, you know, with cyber resilience, to make it more difficult for their critical information infrastructure to be accessed, to help their resilience. So you know, that aspect is, I think, an aspect where we can engage, and we should.
Great. Okay, let's open it up. We'll take several questions because we don't have that much time left. So I'll take several questions and put them on the agenda. If you can introduce yourself.
Yeah, would you remind me when I forget half of them, though? You're younger, I'm more mentally alert.
Introduce yourself, and if you are an alum of the program, please let us know that. We'll start with you in the back, and then we'll come up to Stu.
Thank you. My name is Elizabeth Lestracco, and I'm a graduate student here at SIS, and I was with you in 2005 at the James Madison Michigan State program. It's wonderful seeing you again.
Good to see you too.
My question is more related to the part of the EU that you mentioned with financially stabilizing its eastern member states. And from what has happened recently, do you think that's either financially realistic or even probable for the EU to undertake?
Okay, and then we'll come up here. Can we get the mic up here?
Yeah, Jim, for full disclosure, a long time ago, Jamie and I were colleagues at NATO headquarters, and it was towards the end of the Cold War. Jamie had this very interesting job where every now and then he could write a very thoughtful paper on the strategic and security dynamics of Europe. I, however, Jamie, to remind you, occasionally had to lead the staff that monitored national responses to decisions made on military exercises. And even in theoretical military exercises, it was very, very hard to get 16 nations to agree to theoretical measures of deploying troops around to respond to a Soviet threat, of course. So what would be very interesting to me, and I'm sure to the students, and some of my students are here, I'd like to know how one would implement these this checkmate game that you've described with Russia, or will the decision-making process in NATO just be too cumbersome to react quickly?
Great, thanks. And we'll take one more.
Konstantinos Kanelopoulos. I usually go for 2 questions, as most of you know, but I might go for 3 this time.
Some things never change.
2 if they're part of the same question.
Always.
And you were in the program last spring, right?
Yes. First and foremost, to what extent does the Ukrainian crisis, the Crimean crisis, let's be more particular, highlight not only the importance and the vitality of the transatlantic relationship, but maybe a failure of the transatlantic relationship? What I'm trying to say is that the transatlantic relationship could have possibly failed in Ukraine because of the EU's failure to align its strategy to the east with the US, and because the EU truly underestimated the attractiveness of its model in the Ukrainian eyes. What I'm trying to get is
We're
that...
good. We got it. We're good. We're good. Okay.
That's the first question.
No, that's it. We got it. We don't have that much time. All right.
But I like the fact he's still interested in all the issues. But okay, EU financial instruments. Well, clearly, one thing to be avoided is going from a posture of maybe being too conditional about money, attaching it to IMF agreements, and rightly so, because it has to be said that Transparency International has not given Ukraine a very good rating for anti-corruption in recent years. Let's be honest about it. And therefore, going to the other extreme of suddenly, pushing money in with no conditions at all, most of which will, like the money spent on the Sochi Olympics, where 1/3 of it disappeared into people's bank accounts and was never used for construction. That would be wrong. But probably, given the urgency of the situation, the EU will need to sort of err on the side of not caution, but at least being bold. Because that type of help is necessary. But for example, this could be done in terms of immediate, debt facilitation. If the Russians are now sort of, upping the amount of money that Gazprom claims is owed, one key thing that the EU can do is to help Ukraine with alternative energy supplies by just sending the gas the other way through the pipeline system. That can be done. Those kind of things. Another thing which the EU is looking at, which is not uncontroversial in Europe, particularly with the farmers, is lifting barriers for the Ukraine's trade in agricultural products or certain industrial products or whatever onto European markets, if only as a temporary measure, because Ukraine can help itself in that respect. So there are quite a lot of things that could be done in that respect. The energy thing is probably the most critical. Given that Ukraine is, as you know, very much dependent for its gas supplies on Russia. Decision making in NATO. Well, Stu's right. It can often be cumbersome, but then again, sometimes in a crisis, things suddenly do go quite smoothly. I mean, I've been in many situations in NATO where I myself was surprised that things happen quickly. When push comes to shove, the Allies, when the debate's been had, when the feeling is there's no other option. I remember the Kosovo air campaign in 1999. The Allies do have this habit of sort of coming together because everybody realizes that a dysfunctional alliance isn't in anybody's interest at the end of the day. If the credibility suffers in Kiev over Ukraine, the credibility suffers over the Balkans, or the credibility suffers somewhere else. So I wouldn't sort of overestimate that type of issue. But as I did say, Stu, and I think you're right there, for the next couple of weeks, clearly we've got this very delicate balancing act between sending a clear signal to Russia that it can't be business as usual, while at the same time not doing things which needlessly escalate the situation and don't provide that off-ramp. So it's got to be a balance. Our foreign ministers, I think, when they meet at the beginning of next month and are going to review the state of our relations with Russia, have obviously got to get it right. But that's what a crisis is all about, obviously. Failure of the transatlantic relationship, I honestly don't see it that way. Yes, you can argue that maybe the EU should have predicted ahead of the Vilnius summit last November, what was going to happen with Yukanovic sort of, at the last minute rejecting the association agreement because he felt that it imposed too many conditions on Ukraine while not offering sufficient money up front in exchange, and then a Russian offer which offered a lot of money up front, 15 billion euros, and a cheaper gas price with no conditions. But the EU is a rules-based organisation, of course, but there is a time when you're in a crisis where, the immediate cure or the immediate thing that takes the headache away is better than the long-term cure. And maybe it was a failure of imagination to the extent that we probably felt that we had more time to sort of ask Ukraine to accept this very long-term reform program, which is in Ukraine's interest, by the way, ultimately, without recognizing that the situation was so urgent. And we should perhaps have put a bit more money up front. Yeah, that's maybe a lesson. But, the problem often with international organizations, they have their instruments, which they're very attached to, like we have our Partnership for Peace. And there is a tendency when a crisis comes to say, let's just do more of the instrument. Let's have more meetings. Let's have, more agreements on tariff barriers without recognizing that sometimes you have to put those instruments aside and have some kind of more emergency rescue package. Remember John Maynard Keynes, who said famously, in the long run, we'll all be dead, indeed. And the problem with a lot of these reform packages is that they work over a 10-year period. But that said, the EU, I think, has done very well in this crisis. And I'm not saying this just for diplomatic reasons. It has come together. Germany has been very robust. Chancellor Merkel, despite the fact that 6,200 German companies do trade with Russia. The EU, has quite quickly imposed sanctions. I mean, they've got to keep this unity, but I think finally they see in Ukraine, the test for them to become a true strategic actor. And maybe this is the moment when, as I say, they'll, not start to have a million policies everywhere in the world, but really sort of focus on this type of thing. So let's see how it goes.
Great. Well, we've actually come to the end of our time.
Well, we're ready.
And I just want to say again, congratulations to AU Abroad and to Jerry for such a wonderful program in Brussels. Again, to thank Jamie, not just for coming here today and speaking with us, but for all that you do for the program in Brussels. It's great to have so many folks who've been through the program here. And we're going out of the room for an hour, and then we come back in at 6 o'clock for a reception. So I hope folks will be able to come back for that and be able to spend more time visiting with Jamie and with Jerry. So with that, thank you all very much. And Jamie, thanks again.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Jim. Thanks a lot. Cheers. Yeah, again, let me know.